Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here at Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our board of co-chairs, and our president and CEO, Mark Melman, thank you for joining us on this solemn day to mark the first anniversary of the October 7th terrorist attacks. As many of you know, 1 year ago today, on that horrific day, some 1,200 Israelis were murdered, including 46 Americans. Women were raped, and some 250 people were kidnapped and taken hostage by Hamas. For the past year, DMFI has been working to raise awareness of these atrocities. We've hosted hostage families and survivors of the attacks on Capitol Hill and at the DNC convention in Chicago. We projected images of the hostages on buildings across Chicago. We screened footage of the atrocities to Capitol Hill audiences, and we regularly send materials and briefings to members of Congress and their staffs to help better understand the ensuing war. We believe that by reflecting on this horrific event, it will help us to never forget and help us all find some solace amid the anguish. Today's event is streaming across social media platforms. You can find us at our handle @DemMaj for Israel. That's on your screen as well. If you have a question, you can put it in the comments section wherever you're watching, or if you're on Zoom, you can enter it in the Q&A section. Please also consider checking us out on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn, and you can sign up for our news and updates at dmfi.org. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our board co-chairs. First, Todd Richmond, and then we'll go to Ann Lewis, who will introduce our distinguished guests today. Todd?
Rachel, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate that, and congratulations on all the work that you and Mark Melman, the entire staff of DMFI, what you're doing is so important. So thank you. It's a real pleasure to introduce a good friend of mine, Congressman Dan Goldman, who is the congressman from the 10th Congressional District here in New York. He has a long and distinguished resume. Many people know him as the lead counsel in the first impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump. He's a former U.S. attorney in the Southern District, I believe, in down here as well. He has been deputy chief of the organized crime unit. He's been a lead counsel. He's worked for the SEC, and the list goes on and on and on. But for today's purpose, he's also been a real important voice for Israel. And he's been a real important voice for the hostage families and ensuring that Israel has the military capabilities to defend itself. When we need something, when the first people that DMFI and the pro-Israel community goes to is Congressman, Dan Goldman. And on top of that, I wanted to make a special thank you to his staff. A lot of people here don't realize that so many members of Congress, their staffs are not just inundated with anti-Israel emails, but the congressman's office has been vandalized. People have been harassed, and we wanted to say a big thank you as well to your staff. They have been amazing, and we greatly appreciate them. So without further ado, let me say thank you to the congressman, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Todd, for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me on what is a very difficult day for all of us. And I certainly brings back memories for me of being awoken at 6:29 in the morning by sirens in my Tel Aviv hotel. I was there with a family, my family rather, and we, took my 3 little kids and went to the bomb shelter back and forth. And unlike Israeli kids who grow up understanding what these sirens mean, my kids had no idea. So they still are dealing with the trauma of that day. And of course, that does not compare to the trauma that all of Israel is still reeling from. And certainly the families of those who were murdered, the families of the hostages, and 100 of whom are still in Gaza, including 4 Americans and 3 deceased Americans. So it's obviously been an incredibly trying year, I think, for so many of us, and it has not helped, to put it mildly, that in the aftermath of the worst terrorist attack against Israel in its history, there has been a massive surge in anti-Semitism. I think I, for one, who have felt like I had many allies in the civil rights community, certainly feel abandoned by many for whom Jews have stood up throughout our history, because of a shared experience of persecution and discrimination. And that's been very, very difficult to understand and to swallow. The reality, and I think we've seen it in the last month, is on full display, is that this is not a narrow conflict between Israel and Hamas. This is not just about Israel and Gaza, or even Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. This is a small part of a larger global conflict, certainly regional, but I think global when you start to see Russia and Iran working together, that wants to erase democracy as we know it. And Israel is a proxy for democracy for the United States. And Iran and all of its various proxies, which includes Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Syria and Iraq, and of course the IRGC itself in Iran, are all focused on destroying Israel, wiping it off the face of the earth. And that's just the first step before they would come for us. So this is not simply whether Hamas remains in Gaza. This is whether democracy survives in the Middle East. And it is an existential fight. And we've now seen it in the north of Israel as the conflict with Hezbollah, which is far more powerful than Hamas, has escalated. And we've seen it for the first time in history twice, with Iran itself sending missiles and drones at Israel. And let's not take this lightly, because Israel has an excellent missile defense system. And Israel has spent money on infrastructure for bomb shelters rather than for terrorism tunnels, as Hamas spent their money. Without that, there would be many, many casualties from the rockets fired by Hezbollah, the missiles fired by Iran. And this is a massive, a much bigger conflict than many would have us believe. And it's part of that, partially because of that reason, that we must support Israel. And that does not matter if you are Jewish and you believe in a Jewish state, as I'm sure so many of us do, but it is just as strong a case if you simply believe in democracy and against a terrorist regime. And of course, it's no coincidence that this attack on October 7th, 1 year ago, happened right as news of a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia was picking up steam. That would be very detrimental to Iran. And while there may not be direct confirmation that Iran was involved in the organization and planning and execution of this attack, there could be no doubt that Iran was very happy to see it, and that Iran understood, or sorry, I should say that Hamas understood what Iran, their benefactor, would support. And I've certainly been an advocate for the last year in making sure that the United States remains in full and complete support of Israel. We may disagree on some politics, which we do. I certainly do. We may disagree on some tactics, but ultimately that is irrelevant because we must agree that we have an ironclad bond as democratic allies, as strategic partners, and for many, and justifiably, as the only Jewish state in the world that was created in the aftermath of the worst genocidal atrocity in history that left so many Jews homeless, and so many were rejected by countries around the world, including, I might add, the United States. So let's not trivialize the situation. There's one Jewish state. There are many Arab states, and that is very important for those of us who care about our history and our culture and our traditions and our religion, to be sure that we maintain going forward. I know we're going to get to a Q&A. I could obviously talk about this all day long. It's pretty much consumed me for the last year. But I'm really grateful for DMFI's work, and Rachel went through a lot of it. And I can tell you that it is, from the Capitol Hill perspective, it is very, very important to be, for all of us, less me than some of my colleagues, to receive the kind of information that DMFI is able to provide. Rachel mentioned some of it, but certainly Mark's polling is incredibly valuable for those of us who are making the case as to why, even if you may disagree politically with the leadership in Israel, we must nonetheless support Israel, the country. So I'll turn it back over to you, Todd or Ann, and look forward to.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Goldman. And now, I think good. Thank you, Congressman Goldman. And now I'm honored to introduce my friend, Yossi Klein Halevi, a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Yossi is the author of the bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, a searching work seeking dialogue for Palestinians on the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been published and fairly widely read, I would say, in Arabic. Yossi also wrote Like Dreamers, a brilliant history of the battle for the old city of Jerusalem, which has echoes today, and Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, recounting his own youthful admiration and subsequent rejection of Meir Kahane. I recommend them all. Yossi immigrated to Israel in 1982 from Brooklyn. He served with the IDF in Gaza during the first Intifada. His leadership continues today, and we are so grateful to have him with us. Thank you. Yossi?
Well, thanks so much, Ann, and hi, everyone. Delighted to be with all of you, especially today, and deeply grateful for all the work that you do. This is a very strange day in Israel, in the sense that it's not quite like any Memorial Day that we've experienced before. There's a feeling of an unresolved wound, both because of the hostages and because we're still in this war. And something has changed in the Israeli persona. Those of you who have known Israelis and Israeli society over the years will appreciate that Israel really prided itself on its ability to maintain the pretense of normal life in the middle of even existential threat. And that pretense is gone. Since October 7th, the veneer of normalcy has cracked. And in some ways today really feels like a relief, because what we're all carrying since October 7th is this sense of acute vulnerability. And personally, certainly fear but more than that, emotional vulnerability. And there really is a sense today that everyone is in mourning together, and there's a feeling of open mourning, which was very rare in Israel in the past. So there's something about this day which is really, I'd say, a relief, emotionally a relief. Looking at October 7th as a strategic catastrophe, there's something surreal about the fact that Israel's the greatest blow inflicted on Israel in our history, the worst surprise attack since the Yom Kippur War, happened on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, almost exactly to the day. And what made this so strange was that in the weeks leading up to October 7th, 2023, the Israeli media was filled with articles, the talking heads on the news, analyzing yet again, how is it possible that we could have been taken by surprise? And then October 7th, 2023, and an even worse surprise hits us. And I think that there's a not just a direct link in terms of the irony of being surprised again, but the reason why we were surprised 50 years ago on Yom Kippur, and the reason why we were surprised last year, is really the same. Because they're developed what we call in Hebrew, you'll recognize the root of this word, conceptia. We developed a concept. And 50 years ago, the concept was that Arab countries wouldn't dare attack Israel, not after our decisive victory 6 years earlier in 1967. And the concept, the conceptia, until October 7th, was that Hamas isn't interested in going to war with us. And so we focused all of our energies on the north, on keeping tabs on Hezbollah. And this extraordinary gap between how ineffective our intelligence was in Gaza compared to how superbly our intelligence has functioned in the north really tells us it's a warning about ideology, about imposing a certain preconceived idea of reality on reality. And it blinds you to seeing what's actually in front of you. Now, we had the intelligence. This is the irony. We had the intelligence for Gaza. We knew that they were preparing, but we didn't interpret the intelligence properly because the conceptia deceived us. And so I think that just generally the way that I've internalized this is be very careful about going too far with your preconceived notions, whether it's ideology or any other way in which you rigidly look at reality, and try to be supple, try to approach problems with an open mind. And so we learned that very painfully in 1973, and even more painfully last year. There have been basic assumptions that we held until October 7th, which were upended with the massacre. The first was that our intelligence is our deterrence is intact, that Israel is capable of conveying a credible military deterrence to the region. And that was shattered on October 7th. The way that I define the war that we're fighting now is a war for the restoration of our lost deterrence. Our weakest enemy delivered the worst blow in our history. Our state-of-the-art border was overrun by terrorists on tractors, followed by thousands of Gazans coming on with donkey carts to loot the kibbutzim. The next assumption that was upended on October 7th is that we've created a safe refuge for the Jewish people. Now, this, of course, is foundational to the Israeli ethos. And what happened on October 7th was that the covenant that Zionism made with the Jewish people was broken. Israel today is the most dangerous place in the world to be a Jew, even with the return of virulent anti-Semitism around the world, sometimes violent anti-Semitism. Israel remains the most dangerous place to be a Jew. Another covenant that was broken is that we as a society would do anything in our power to save our fellow Israelis, our fellow Jews who fall into captivity. The fact that we have a prime minister who many of us believe placed his political interests before the lives of his fellow Israelis has destroyed the trust that so many Israelis have had in the durability of the covenant that Israel made with its own citizens. On the positive side of this ledger, we've had a number of assumptions that were upended in a very good way. So, for example, we pivoted from the lowest point of our national solidarity in Israel's history, which was October 6th, to one of the peak moments of our solidarity, which was October 8th. If you had asked me on October 6th, would we be capable, even under threat, even under assault, of reuniting and fighting together as a coherent people? And if you had asked me that on October 6th, I'm not sure what my answer would have been. And so on October 8th, we profoundly surprised ourselves. We reminded ourselves that we haven't forgotten the habits of peoplehood. We were still able to re-inhabit the behavior patterns of people. Another way in which we surprised ourselves as a society was how we effectively mobilized ourselves on October 8th. No one looked to this government, no one that I know, was waiting to see, what does Netanyahu have to say? How is he going to, what direction is he going to give Israelis? I didn't listen to his speeches. I don't know anyone who did. On October 8th, we mobilized ourselves. The government was in complete disarray. It was civic society that stepped into the gap left by not only our most corrupt and most extreme government, but also our most incompetent. And so what we learned on October 8th is that we are a society of tremendous capabilities. Even when our government fails, and this is the most disastrous government by far in our history, we were still capable of rising to the challenge. And I regard Israel of October 8th as the moment of maturation of Israeli society, the moment when we took responsibility for our own fate. What we've seen in the last year in the army is a renewal of morale to the extent that we haven't seen maybe since the Yom Kippur War. Now, I'm worried that the more the fighting goes on two fronts, the more difficult it's going to be for reservists. Many of them have been in uniform for 100, 150 days, and I don't know how much longer we can sustain this. But what we saw over the last year was a renewal of the motivation of young Israelis to sacrifice, and it's been something very moving and powerful to watch. Another assumption that was upended in this war in a positive way was that if we would begin attacking Hezbollah, the Israeli home front would be bombarded by tens of thousands of rockets and missiles. And so far, that hasn't happened. And it could still happen. We know that the Iranian nexus has tens of thousands of missiles left in its arsenal. And if it does choose to fire what it has, then the Iron Dome will be overwhelmed. But so far, we've been surprised by Hezbollah's relative passivity. And we don't know whether Hezbollah is saving its ammunition or whether it's been taken so profoundly by surprise that it hasn't been capable of stirring again. The congressman spoke about Iran, and for me, this is not the Israeli-Hamas war or the Israeli-Hezbollah war. What began on October 7th is the Israeli-Iranian war. And until now, we've been fighting the proxies of Iran. But this war cannot end with Iran still on the nuclear threshold. If we do not destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities, this war will have been a major, and I would add, historic defeat for Israel. Now that's going to place us, and you all know this better than I do, in direct variance with most of international public opinion, with the American government. And I don't know how we're going to navigate that. But I do know that we cannot allow this war to end with the Ayatollahs on the nuclear threshold. The last point I'll make, and then we'll open for conversation, is almost a metaphysical observation, which is that over the last century, the Jewish people has found itself on the front line against forces of evil 3 times. The first was Nazism, the second was Soviet communism, and the third is Islamist radicalism. And what unites those 3 movements, Nazism, Soviet communism, and radical Islamism, is that all 3 were totalitarian ideologies that aimed at world domination. All 3 identified the Jewish people as their primary or a primary obstacle toward achieving their goals. And all 3 of these totalitarian movements were prepared to use absolutely any means without any moral constraints. Now, for me, this is really, in some ways, a theological question, and we won't go into that. That's not our agenda today. But there is the question of why do forces of evil over the last 100 years repeatedly choose the Jews as their primary enemy? And my operative conclusion, my practical conclusion, is that when you're facing absolute evil, you need to fight with determination, with courage. And that's what I see Israel, how I see Israel has responded to October 7th. On October 7th, we had a revelation of pure evil, and we all knew it. And I think in some way that's why it's so hard to move on past October 7th, why we're all still in some ways riveted to that moment. It was a revelation of evil, absolute evil. And so even as much of the world tries to shift the onus of evil from our genocidal enemies onto us, this is a moment really for Israel and its friends to stand in our truth, no matter how isolated we are, and affirm that we are on the side that is fighting evil. And that gives us the strength, I believe, to prevail.
Yossi, thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks there. And I'm going to turn back to you in a moment with some questions. Congressman Goldman, if you're still on, I'd love to start with you. Yossi mentioned the threat from Iran and Iran's proxies, and of course we are a month out from a presidential election, and we have a question from Gail. Are the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris and Biden supporting Israel to remove the nuclear threat from Iran?
I think broadly, yes. I think certainly the Democratic Party, our leadership, the vast majority of our elected officials stand steadfastly with Israel and recognize the threat that Iran would pose with true nuclear capabilities. And we agree that we agree with Yossi, what he said, we cannot allow Iran to attain a nuclear bomb. That is simply unacceptable in this day and age, given what their avowed intent is, what their and what they have done, both now through the IRGC, but also through their proxies. So yes, that is something that is a red line. I feel very comfortable saying for the Democratic Party, and I think for the vast majority of Americans. What happens now is, I think, a difficult strategic question, and to some extent a tactical question. I think that after so many fits and starts of a hostage agreement, where certainly I understand and agree with many of the things Yossi said about Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, at least at the end, seemed to resist the opportunity to get hostages back without agreeing to a permanent ceasefire. But the one through line through the last year is that Sinwar and Hamas have consistently moved the goalposts and have been unwilling to enter into any agreement. And at some point, especially as Hezbollah rained rockets down on Israel from the north, and you have so many Israelis displaced from the south because of October 7th, and tens of thousands of Israelis displaced from the north because of Hezbollah's nearly 10,000 rockets starting on October 8th fired into Israel. It's just an untenable situation to live with. And so I think Israel very understandably is protecting itself by going on the offensive. Because if it just simply sits there and waits around, ultimately Iran and its proxies can overwhelm the country of Israel. The question now becomes, what does Israel do in response to the ballistic missiles that were sent from Iran a little over a week ago? And I think there are sort of three options to consider. One is to go after military targets, which is, for the most part, what Iran did with their ballistic missiles. The second is to go after Iranians' oil industry, whether it be their fields, their drills, their ports, their mechanism to move oil. And the third would be to go after Iran's nuclear sites. And I think there are lots of pros and cons to all of them, but it is an incredibly complicated situation. And I, for one, am very grateful that President Biden has ordered such an overwhelming military presence from the United States Navy to be placed in the region. It's an unprecedented posture of force from the United States, which I can tell you has a deterrent effect on Iran. So that will certainly be taken into consideration as Israel makes its decision.
Thanks, Congressman. And we're really pleased to see very strong statements from both the president and vice president today, marking the anniversary. Yossi, you've written so much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Does October 7th change your perspective on any chances of future peace there?
Well, one of the questions that I was asked a lot after October 7th by journalists was, what would you write to your Palestinian neighbor today? I wrote a book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and what would I write today? And my answer was, I wouldn't write anything, because I don't have the emotional bandwidth to reach out. And that book was really an attempt to not only empathize with Palestinian suffering, but to understand the Palestinian narrative and to explain my narrative to Palestinians and invite Palestinians to respond with their narrative. And I don't have the patience right now to engage with the Palestinian narrative, not when my narrative is under such sustained assault. Now, I don't regret writing that book. I'm really glad the book exists and is out there, and I think it's been useful for people in this period. But emotionally, I'm not there. The takeaway of almost all Israelis from October 7th is that it is inconceivable to go for a two-state solution, certainly anytime soon. I still believe in the principle of a two-state solution. The way that I would put it is that the only thing that's worse than a two-state solution is one state. And I still believe that. But the notion that we're going to be able to wrap up a Palestinian state in the near future, which you still hear in diplomatic discourse, is so disconnected from the reality on the ground that it's not even worth responding to. What I do feel is that there are two very different takeaways, two very different conclusions from October 7th. The first, which is again the mainstream Israeli takeaway today, is that we would have to be out of our minds to risk turning the West Bank into another Gaza. And the second takeaway, though, is that Ariel Sharon was right when he pulled us out forcibly from Gaza and separated us from Gaza, because these two peoples cannot live together in one political entity. Now, that's a more complicated takeaway, and it's a little more nuanced, and Israelis are not ready for that now, because it lacks the emotional force of the first conclusion. But I do think that as we distance ourselves from emotionally, as the traumas begin to fade a little bit, we may really be thinking about Ariel Sharon and wondering whether he wasn't right. And how can we imagine creating one state and permanently ruling over this other people by forcibly incorporating them into our society? So I don't think that the two-state idea is dead. I think it's in deep hibernation, and it is for me as well.
Thank you, Yossi. Congressman, I want to share with our listeners something you posted on social media today that really struck me. And last time I checked, it had more than 80,000 views. You wrote, "For those who plan to celebrate and glorify the first anniversary of the most brutal attack on Israel in its history, be fully aware that you are supporting a terrorist organization fueled and funded by Iran, which wants to destroy Western democracy, including the United States." So first, thank you for speaking out in such a forceful way on this, but how do we begin to sort of address those and who believe that October 7th should be glorified or celebrated in some way?
It's a very good question. And there are many moments and there are many times when I feel deflated and defeated. When I, look at the increasingly violent protests, where over the past year it has gone from, I think what you might call legitimate opposition to foreign policy to outright support for terrorist organizations, and calls for violence against Jews, against Israel, that threatens American Jews for simply being Jewish, presumably because of what's going on in Israel. And then I wake up and get up and have to march forward because we can't give up. We can't give in to the misinformation that's out there. We cannot give in to the false narrative that is being perpetuated by the extreme aspects of our country and around the world, frankly. The reality is, I think we need to do a couple things. First of all, we have to continue to try to engage. It is impossible with the protesters as they are now, but we need to be having as many conversations as we can to engage, to talk, especially to young people, and explain a little bit of the actual history, and make sure that there is some more education going around or going on. And then the other thing I think we really need to do, and I say this all the time, that perhaps the most deflating part of this last year for me, as an American Jew, is that so many of people I thought were our allies have abandoned us. But we cannot give up on those allies because we are too small of a population to do this ourselves. And we need like-minded allies who can speak up for us. And I think that the best place to start is not necessarily engaging with the protesters on campus, but trying to engage with our friends, coworkers, fellow students, colleagues, whatever it may be, who have endured a shared history of persecution and discrimination, to get us all back on the same page and working together to fight hate of all kinds, wherever it comes from.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to do one final question, which I will ask you both to address with some brevity, so we can make sure that we are finished at the top of the hour. We still want to hear from our board member, Sam Latter, as well. It's been such a dark year, depressing year. It's hard to see the light. But Yossi, what still gives you hope for the future?
Well, what I mentioned earlier was the model that we have of how Israeli society pivoted from the lowest point of disunity to this really profound rediscovery of our solidarity. Now that's dissipated. We're not there anymore, but we have that in our DNA. And so we have, when the war is over, we're going to face an internal existential question, which is, are we still capable of being a one people anymore? A poll was released today of a large sampling of Israelis, and 69% say they're more worried about the internal schism than they are about external threat. And I am as well. And I, for me, the great challenge is going to be recreating our commonality. And I believe that we have the ability to do that, and we have, more importantly, we have the precedent. So that's one thing that really gives me hope.
Thanks, Yossi. Congressman? You're muted.
Excuse me. I'll address this, but I was reading the Q&A, and I think a lot of people understandably have questions about the Democratic ticket right now in the election. So I would like to address that as well. But the optimism I feel and I believe is there is that our people have been through this before. And in fact, there are times when we have disagreed among ourselves, as Yossi points out. And I think that at least as I feel here in New York and in the United States, there are a lot of differences on the Jewish spectrum. We are not a monolith. Many have different views, but I certainly sense and feel a much greater connection to Judaism from so many. And it has awoken something in a lot of American Jews who have lived a secular existence frankly, without much anti-Semitism since the Holocaust, or at least in the last few decades. And now we realize what our people have gone through and why we always say never forget on Yom HaShoah. And I think that that unity, that camaraderie, that commitment is to our religion and our culture will carry us through. Just on some of the questions about Vice President Harris and the Democratic Party writ large. The Democratic Party overwhelmingly supports Israel. You look at President Biden, who has steadfastly stuck by Israel for 1 year in the face of growing international pressure. And frankly, in the face of conduct by Israeli leadership that is oftentimes, I think, has been difficult to deal with. You see Senator Schumer, Leader Jeffries, and the vast majority of the Democratic Party. There are a few on the extreme left who are clearly anti-Israel and to some extent anti-Semitic. But that is a much smaller group than its voice and its perception would have you believe. I think you just have to look at the supplemental bill on aid to Israel, where there were about 175 Democrats voting for it, and I think 37 voting against it. And that's for a combination of reasons. And I think in the Democratic Party, to the extent that more than 10 or so object to what Israel is doing, it is much more concerns about Prime Minister Netanyahu than it is about Israel itself. I am confident from many of the discussions that I have had with those close to her, with the second gentleman, and just with my own interactions with Vice President Harris, that she means what she says and that she will be a steadfast supporter of Israel. There will be no arms embargo. There will be no effort to threaten Israel, to undermine Israel, that ultimately she will be there for Israel. And I had questions myself, but I do feel confident that what she is saying is what she truly believes. And I know that Doug Emhoff is right there. And remember, this was the first administration to ever have a national strategy to counter anti-Semitism before October 7th. And so I do think that it's we can have faith that this Democratic ticket will continue to support Israel. And the last thing I'll say just before turning it over is it is the leeway that we give Israel with our support is greater than probably any other country. You look at Ukraine, we have put significant limitations on what Ukraine can do with the weapons that we have provided them, including up until very, very recently, not allowing Ukraine to use our weapons to fire into Russia at all. So it is not, it is actually not the case that we put more restrictions on Israel than others. It's the opposite. And that is because of our close alliance, our strategic alliance, the fact that our intelligence is so intertwined, relies so much on each other, and because Israel is the only democratic state in that region fighting for its survival. So I frankly think that Israel must remain a bipartisan issue. The Democratic Party understands that, and I urge everyone, wherever you are on the spectrum, to double down on the pro-Israel Democrats. And we saw some of that in this past election cycle, but that's where the party is, that's where the party should be. And if we are all committed to that, both in office and outside, then Israel will continue to be a bipartisan issue with tremendous support.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Appreciate your addressing a lot of those questions that have popped up in the Q&A and frankly in our inbox. So grateful to have you here. I'm so glad you and your family are safe. Yossi, it's always a pleasure and a real honor to speak with you. Glad that you and your family are safe. Thank you. And now I'm very pleased to turn it over to Sam Lauder, our board member.
Thank you, Rachel. And I know that all of us, we knew October 7th, the anniversary was approaching, but I think we all woke up with a pit in our stomach. And being here with you two, just a heartfelt thank you to our friends, Congressman Dan Goldman and Yossi Klein Halevi, for taking the time to mark this solemn and intensely important day with the DMFI community. Most important for your leadership and wisdom. Thank you for helping us reflect and grieve by sharing the stories. You play a role in ensuring that we never forget and we continue to honor the souls we've lost. Last November, the parents of Romy Gonen gave me this dog tag. I couldn't believe how strong they were in November, a month in. And 1 month in, they were sure she'd come home any day, but Romy is still there. We all hope and pray for the safe return of Romy and all the 100 or so hostages that remain in Gaza. And like you, we are praying for the safety of the IDF troops fighting Iran and its proxies in this multi-front defensive war. Over the past year, DMFI has worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the brutality of that day and ensure that the Democratic Party remains supportive of Israel and its security. We have been in constant touch with allies in Capitol Hill, supporting them with briefing materials, messaging points, and hosting screenings of the Hamas atrocities. We've brought hostage families and displaced families from the north to meet with members of Congress. We've mobilized supporters like you to send letters to members in support of Israel's effort in this multi-front defensive war. We talk to the media regularly to make sure the voice and perspectives of pro-Israel Democrats are heard. We aggressively push back on disinformation online and calling out the small but vocal group of Israel detractors within our party. And so critical these days, the efforts of DMFI PAC, our separate sister organization, were critical in defeating anti-Israel squad members and candidates who were eager to join the squad this year. Now DMFI PAC is committed to helping elect Kamala Harris and pro-Israel Democratic candidates up and down the ballot next month. The reality is we could not be doing any of this without your support, the support of this audience. Your involvement with DMFI helps keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel and strengthens the U.S.-Israel relationship. We are deeply grateful to all of you. If you haven't signed up and you are interested, please sign up with us to stay in touch at dmfi.org and follow us on social media, on all social media at, I'm going to have to spell this out for you. It's Democratic Majority for Israel, but it's spelled DEMMAJ, the number 4, Israel. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. Thank you again so much, Yossi and Dan, for your leadership, your wisdom, for everything you do. And we look forward to seeing all of you next time. With that, farewell.